The Game of Thrones has swallowed kings and conquerors, prophets and dragons, and still it hungers. It has consumed the honourable and the treacherous alike, ground down the mighty beneath its iron wheel, and left nothing behind but ash and memory. But there are forces older than the Iron Throne. There are powers that walk the earth before the first men carved their names into weirwood bark, before Valyria rose from volcanic stone, before the long night first swallowed the world in cold and silence. And on the night, Melisandre of Ashai opened a glass, candle, and screamed, her prayer into the void between worlds. Something heard her. Not one something. 9. They came through a rift torn in the fabric of the Wolfswood 3 miles south of Winterfell's walls, arriving in the manner of all things that cross between worlds, without ceremony, without warning, and without any understanding of where they had landed. One moment they had been marching through a pass in a mountain range that no Maester had ever charted. The next, they stood in a forest of ancient oak and pine, snow falling in curtains around them, the wind carrying a cold so deep it felt like a living thing pressing against the chest. Gandalf the Grey was the first to recover. He had lived through the darkening of Valinor, had walked Middle-earth for 3 ages of the world, had stood before a Balrog on a bridge of stone and broken it with the word of his power. He knew, with the particular certainty of a Mire intelligence housed in aging flesh, that something fundamental had changed. The sky above the Wolfswood was wrong. The stars were wrong. The cold was wrong, not the ordinary cold of a winter night, but something laced with malice, with intent, with the specific and terrible hunger of a darkness that predated even his own long memory. He planted his staff in the snow and was silent for 3 full breaths. "We are not in Middle-earth," he said. "No," said Aragorn, hand already on the hilt of Anduril, eyes moving through the trees with the instincts of a Dunedain ranger who had spent decades surviving in wilderness that would kill ordinary men. "We are not." Around them, the fellowship gathered itself from the snow. Legolas stood perfectly still, his elven eyes open to the darkness, reading the forest the way a scholar reads a page. Gimli had his axe in hand before he'd fully regained his footing, which was simply his nature. Boromir had drawn his sword, a Gondorian blade, well made and practical, and positioned himself between the hobbits and their tree line without being asked, which said everything necessary about the man. Frodo stood with one hand inside his shirt, fingers brushing the chain of the one ring by instinct, then stopped himself and let his hand fall. Sam stood beside him with the expression of a hobbit who had followed his master into Mordor and had, therefore, decided that no situation, however strange, was worth panicking about until he had more information. Merry and Pippin were looking at the snow with the focused attention of people trying to determine if it was, in fact, ordinary snow. It was. "There are torches," Legolas said quietly, "to the north, a fortification of significant size. And beyond it," he paused, and even for an elf, the pause carried weight. "Something moves in the far distance, something vast, and cold in a way that has nothing to do with the weather." Aragorn looked at Gandalf. Gandalf looked north, toward the torches, and his expression tightened in a way that they, members of the Fellowship, had learned to read as worse than I feared. "We go toward the light," the wizard said. "Whatever darkness lies beyond it, we will face it better with walls at our backs and information in our hands. Move quietly. These are not our woods, and we do not yet know whose swords are in them." They were, of course, discovered before they had traveled half a mile. The northern scouts were good, better than Boromir had expected from what initially appeared to be a feudal kingdom operating on medieval military logic. 3 of them dropped from the trees without sound, arrows drawn, and were followed within seconds by 4 more, emerging from the underbrush on either flank. The lead scout was a hard-faced woman of perhaps 30 with dark hair and the kind of eyes that had looked at death recently and regularly. She looked at the Fellowship with the specific, calculating attention of someone assessing a threat. Her gaze moved from Gandalf's staff to Legolas's ears to Gimli's, axe to the hobbits, where it stopped. "What in 7 hells?" she said, not quite to anyone. "We mean no harm," Aragorn said, in the careful, even tone he used when addressing parties who had arrows trained on him. "We arrived in your forest without intending to and without understanding how. We are travelers, fighters, and whatever is moving in the darkness to the north of your walls." He paused, choosing his next words with the deliberateness of a man who understood that the wrong ones could start a war. "We have faced things like it before." The scout stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Gandalf, who met her gaze with the patient, ancient calm of something that had seen civilizations rise and fall and had learned that the right expression in a tense moment was worth more than any weapon. "Lord Commander will want to see you," the scout said finally. She had not lowered her arrow. "All of you. Even the—" she gestured at the hobbits. "Whatever they are." "Hobbits," Sam said, with the quiet dignity of someone who had answered this question too many times to be offended by it anymore. "We are hobbits." The scout absorbed this information, filed it somewhere, made no visible reaction. "Move," she said. And so the Fellowship of the Ring walked out of the Wolfswood and toward the fires of Winterfell, while somewhere in the vast darkness to the north, 10,000 dead things turned their faces south and kept walking. If you want to see more characters arrive in Westeros, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Winter is coming. Winterfell at the edge of the long night was a fortress that had stopped pretending to be anything else. The banners still flew, stark direwolf grey against white, but the courtyards that had once housed servants and merchants, and the ordinary commerce of a great northern seat now held siege equipment, weapons racks, and the kind of organized, exhausted industry that Boromir recognized immediately as an army preparing for a battle it did not expect to survive. Fires burned in iron braziers along every wall. The gates were reinforced with timber beams thicker than a man's torso. And everywhere, the people of Winterfell moved with the particular economy of motion that came, not from training but from the simpler and more brutal teacher of desperation. Boromir had seen it in Gondor. He recognized it here. The Fellowship was brought through the main gate under escort, 12 northern soldiers now, having picked up reinforcements at the outer wall and into the great courtyard, where they were met by a silence that spread outward from there, arrival like ripples from a stone, dropped in still water. Soldiers stopped sharpening blades. Archers paused in their work. Even the horses in the far paddock seemed to still. The Fellowship of the Ring was, by any standard of Westerosi experience, an impossible collection of beings. An old man in grey robes carrying a staff that faintly luminescent in the firelight. A tall, scarred ranger with a sword that seemed to drink the light around it. An elf, though none of the northerners had a word for what Legolas was. Only the instinctive, skin-prickling recognition that he was not human in the way they understood human. A dwarf built like a siege weapon with legs. And 4 creatures half the height of a man, dressed in travelling clothes, looking around Winterfell's courtyard with the alert, curious expressions of people who were frightened but determined not to show it. Word reached the great hall before they did. It always does, in places where ravens are the slowest form of communication, and rumour is faster than both. Jon Snow was waiting for them. He stood at the head of the great hall with the careful stillness of a man who had learned that stillness projected authority he did not always feel. He was younger than Boromir had expected from a Lord Commander, younger than command usually looked, with the kind of eyes that had seen the dead walk and had not entirely recovered from the experience. Beside him stood a woman of extraordinary presence, silver-haired, straight-backed, with 2 dragons' worth of certainty in her bearing and the specific, measuring gaze of someone who had survived long enough to treat every new variable as a potential threat. Daenerys Targaryen did not look at the Fellowship with wonder. She looked at them with assessment. Behind them both, half in shadow near the far wall, stood a red-robed woman whose eyes found Aragorn the moment he entered the hall and did not leave him. Melisandre of Ashai. Her lips moved slightly, as though she were reading words written on his face that no one else could see. "Who are you?" Jon Snow said. Not a question, precisely. More the opening move in a negotiation whose terms he hadn't yet established. Gandalf stepped forward. In the great hall of Winterfell, with its stone walls and its firelit, shadows and its smell of cold, air and burning wood and the particular metallic undertone of a castle, preparing for siege, the wizard looked simultaneously out of place and utterly inevitable, as though he had always been going to stand in this hall, in this moment. And the only surprising thing was that it had taken this long. "My name is Gandalf," he said. "I have carried many names across many ages of a world that is not this one. What I am is difficult to explain in terms your majestas would find satisfying. What I can tell you is this: the darkness gathering beyond your walls is not new. It is ancient, and it has a hunger that no wall and no army and no dragon alone will be sufficient to stop." He let that settle. "We did not choose to come here, but we are here, and we have faced the dark before." The hall was silent. Daenerys spoke first. "You arrived from nowhere, in the middle of the night, in the forest outside our walls, days before the dead reach us." Her voice was measured, precise, and carried the specific temperature of someone who had been deceived by trusted advisors and had adjusted accordingly. "You'll forgive me if I find the timing difficult to accept as coincidence." "There are no coincidences in this," Melisandre said from the shadows, and every head in the hall turned toward her. Her eyes were still on Aragorn. "I asked the Lord of Light for champions. I opened the glass candle and I poured my prayer into the fire, and I asked for warriors from beyond the known world." She stepped forward, and her red robes caught the firelight and held it. He answered. Aragorn met her gaze steadily. He had dealt with beings of power and prophecy before. He had spent a lifetime being told what he was destined to be and had learned that destiny was less a gift than a demand. "Whatever you believe us to be," he said quietly, "we are not symbols. We are not signs. We are people. And we would rather know the shape of what we are facing than stand here being examined, like ravens brought in from a storm." Something shifted in Jon Snow's expression. It was subtle, the slight relaxation of a man who had expected politics and received instead the vocabulary of a soldier. He glanced at Daenerys. She gave him nothing back, which was itself a kind of answer. "The army of the dead," Jon said, "numbers in the hundreds of thousands. Their general cannot be killed by any weapon we have found, save dragonglass and Valyrian steel. Our dragons can fight their dead ones. Our armies cannot hold a field against that many whites." He paused. "We are making our stand here because there is nowhere else left to make it. If Winterfell falls, the living lose." He looked at Gandalf with the direct, unadorned honesty that was either his greatest strength or the thing most likely to get him killed. "So I'll ask you plainly, can you fight?" Gimli laughed. It was not a gentle sound. "Ask us plainly," the dwarf said, resting his axe across his shoulders, with the casual ease of a creature born to violence, "and you'll get a plain answer. Aye, we can fight." Jon Snow looked at the fellowship, at the wizard and the ranger, and the elf and the dwarf, and the soldier and the four small creatures who had not flinched once since entering a hall full of armed northerners, who outweighed them by a significant margin. He made the decision the way he made most decisions, quickly, based on evidence, and in full awareness that he might be wrong. "Then you'll eat," he said, "and you'll tell us everything you know about fighting things that don't die. And in the morning, we plan." Daenerys said nothing, but her eyes stayed on Gandalf long after the wizard had looked away, and in them was the careful, controlled uncertainty of a woman who had never before encountered something she could not categorize. Melisandre returned to the shadows. Her lips had stopped moving, but her expression, for the first time in weeks, held something that might have been relief. Gandalf did not sleep. This was not unusual. The wizard had never required sleep in the way mortals did. Rest, certainly. The quiet gathering of thought and intention that passed for recovery in a mire. Consciousness housed in aging bone and flesh, but not sleep. not the vulnerable, unconscious surrender that men and hobbits and even elves required. In Winterfell, on the night after their arrival, while the fellowship was distributed across guest quarters that had been hastily cleared of weapon stores and sleeping soldiers, Gandalf walked. He walked the walls first, nodding to the northern sentries who watched him with the uncertain expressions of men who had been told the old stranger was probably an ally and had not yet decided whether they believed it. He walked the courtyard, reading the preparations with the eye of someone who had advised the defense of Helm's Deep and the siege of Minas Tirith and could recognize in the placement of oil barrels and archer positions and the reinforcement of the main gate both competence and the particular geometry of a plan designed by people who expected to die implementing it. The preparations were good. They were not good enough. But he filed that assessment away for the morning council and kept walking. Then he went down into the crypts. He did not entirely know why. Some instinct older than his time in Middle-earth drew him down the stone steps and into the cold below Winterfell, where the kings of Winter sat in their carved alcoves and iron swords rusted slowly at their feet. The crypts smelled of deep stone and centuries and the specific mineral cold of a place that had never been warm. Torches burned in iron sconces at intervals, throwing long shadows across the carved faces of dead Starks, and Gandalf walked among them slowly, staff tapping against the stone floor, reading the silence the way he had learned in long ages to read all silences, as a language, with grammar and vocabulary and things it was trying very hard not to say. He felt it after perhaps 10 minutes, sitting very still beneath the ordinary cold of the crypt, beneath the weight of the dead stone and the carved kings and the sleeping history of the North was something else, a resonance, a frequency of wrongness that he recognized, not because he had encountered it precisely before but because he had encountered its family, the specific magical signature of a power that drew its strength from death, from the negation of warmth and life and the forward motion of living things. In Middle-earth, he had felt it in the Nazgul, in the Barrow-wights, in the slow cold corruption that Sauron radiated outward from Barad-dûr like a dark sun. This was older than any of those things. He stood in the center of the crypts and closed his eyes, and let his Maya senses extend outward, moving through the stone of Winterfell and into the frozen earth beyond its walls and north, following the thread of that wrongness, out across the snowfields and they abandoned villages and they shattered remnants of the Night's Watch's last ranging positions, reaching further than any glass candle and further than any greenseer's vision, until he found the source of it. And then he opened his eyes, because what he found was not something he wanted to examine for longer than necessary. Jon Snow found him there 20 minutes later. The Lord Commander had not slept either, which Gandalf had expected. There was a specific quality to Jon Snow's wakefulness, not the anxious insomnia of a man afraid of what tomorrow held, but the watchful, deliberate consciousness of someone who felt that sleep was a small betrayal of everyone depending on him. The crypts make people uncomfortable, Jon said, stopping a respectful distance away. His voice echoed slightly in the stone chamber. Most of the lords who came to Winterfell have found reasons not to come down here. You sought it out. I needed to feel the shape of what is coming, Gandalf said. Stone is honest. It does not reassure or deceive. It simply holds what has happened, and waits for what will. He looked at Jon Snow steadily. I have felt the darkness beyond your walls. I want you to understand what I mean when I tell you that I have fought things from the earliest ages of my world, servants of a power so vast that the destruction of Sauron, whom I dedicated 3,000 years of this form to opposing, was, in the larger story, a minor victory. He paused. The Night King is not Sauron. He is something different in nature, in method, in ambition. Sauron wanted dominion. He wanted worship and submission and the particular satisfaction of a corrupted intelligence that seeks to impose its order on a living world. The wizard's eyes were old in the torchlight, older than the stones around them. The Night King wants nothing. He is the end of wanting. He is what remains when the warmth of living intention has been extinguished completely. And what remains as decided, with the cold logic of the utterly empty, that all warmth must follow. John was quiet for a moment. You're saying he can't be reasoned with. I am saying there is nothing there to reason with. There is only the cold, and its appetite. Gandalf turned to look at the carved face of a long-dead, stark king. But I noticed something in my reading of his power, something your Red Woman may have sensed and misinterpreted. The Night King's magic is ancient, older than the wall, older than the pact between the first men and the children of the forest. But it is not unlike other dark powers I have encountered. It follows laws. It has a source. And things that have sources. He tapped his staff once against the stone floor, and the sound rang through the crypt like a small bell. Can be unmade at their source. The Night King himself, John said. The Night King himself. Your people already suspect this. Your strategy already gestures toward it. Gandalf looked at him. But you have been thinking of it as an assassination, a military problem with a military solution. I want you to consider that it may also be a magical one, and that magic, in this matter, may be the sharper blade. Jon Snow studied the wizard for a long moment with the evaluating intelligence of a man who had been underestimated his entire life and had therefore developed an acute sensitivity to when he was being told the truth versus when he was being managed. What he saw in Gandalf's face appeared to satisfy him. The crypts aren't safe, he said finally. I've been told they are, but I have a feeling. They are not, Gandalf confirmed, with the gentle directness of someone delivering bad news that needed to be delivered cleanly. The dead kings beneath Winterfell will rise when the Night King is close enough. Whatever protections your people believe these walls provide, plan for the crypts to become a battlefield. He looked at Jon steadily. Put your most vulnerable people somewhere else, or put your most capable fighters here. Jon absorbed this with the stillness of a man adding one more catastrophic variable to a list that was already too long. Then he nodded, once, with the particular economy of motion of someone who had decided that panic was a luxury he could not afford. I'll tell Davos, he said. He'll know how to move people without causing a panic. Good man, you're Davos, Gandalf said approvingly. Though he had spoken to the Onion Knight for less than 10 minutes, he had met enough good men across enough ages to recognize the type immediately. Now, he turned back toward the stairs. I believe your council meets at dawn. I have things to say to it that your queen will not enjoy hearing, and I would prefer to have slept on the phrasing. Jon Snow almost smiled. In the crypts of Winterfell, with the dead kings watching from their stone seats and the long night pressing against the walls above, it was a small and fragile expression, but it was real. This way, he said, and led the wizard back up into the cold. The War Council of Winterfell met at dawn in the Great Hall, and it was, by any standard Boromir had encountered across his years of service to Gondor, one of the most politically combustible rooms he had ever sat in. He had attended the councils of his father, Denetha, steward of Gondor, a man whose intelligence was matched only by his capacity for contempt, who ran his war councils the way a spider runs a web, with himself at the center of every thread and a careful, cultivated awareness of exactly how much pressure each strand could bear before it broke. He had sat in rooms with lords who despised each other across generations of feuding and were nonetheless required to present a unified front against Mordor's advance. He understood, in the specific and practical way of a soldier who had spent his life navigating the politics of survival, that the quality of a military alliance was determined less by the strength of its armies than by the integrity of the relationships between the people commanding them. The relationships in this room were not intact. It was visible in the way Daenerys Targaryen sat, positioned at Jon Snow's left with the careful, deliberate posture of a woman asserting a precedence that had not been formally granted. It was visible in the way the Northern Lords, Lyanna Mormont among them with her extraordinary, concentrated disapproval, positioned themselves slightly away from the Targaryen Queen's advisors. It was visible in the way. Sansa Stark watched Daenerys from across the table with the patient, measuring attention of someone who had survived. Joffrey Baratheon and Ramsay Bolton and had, therefore, developed an extremely accurate sense of which powerful people were dangerous to trust, and it was visible, most clearly, in the way Jon Snow sat between all of these forces and bore the weight of them with the expression of a man who had died once and found the experience preferable to certain kinds of meetings. The Fellowship had been given seats along the left wall, observers. Nominally, though Gandalf had positioned his chair at a slight angle that placed him in the conversation rather than outside it, which was either deliberate or simply the natural geometry of a being who had never in his long life been content to merely watch. Sir Davos Seaworth opened the council. He laid out the tactical situation with the blunt, unadorned clarity of a man who had never had the luxury of softening bad news. The army of the dead was 2 days out, moving faster than anticipated. The Dothraki would ride first. The Unsullied would hold the perimeter. The dragons would target the dead's flanks. The trebuchets were positioned along the outer walls. And then Winterfell would hold. Or it would not, and if it did not, there was nowhere else. Daenerys listened to this with the expression of someone who had already wargamed the scenario 17 times and had not yet found a version she was satisfied with. When Davos finished, she looked at Gandalf. "You spoke to Jon last night," she said. "In the crypts." It was not an accusation, precisely, but it carried the temperature of one. "I would know what was said." "Everything I said to Jon Snow, I will say here," Gandalf replied, with the mild, untroubled patience of someone who had dealt with rulers of considerably more established power than a queen in exile. "The Night King's magic has a source. Destroying him destroys the army. This your people already know. What they may not have fully considered is that the approach to the Night King should include a magical component, not merely a military one." He looked around the table. "I can provide that component, but I will need freedom of movement on the battlefield, and I will need your dragon riders to trust my judgment at critical moments, even when my actions appear counterintuitive." Daenerys's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're asking me to give an unknown quantity authority over my dragons." "I am asking you," Gandalf said, with the same mild patience, "to consider that the last time someone in this world faced a darkness of this specific nature, they required help from sources they did not initially trust." He let that breathe for a moment. "I am not unknown. I am simply new. There is a difference." It was Boromir who broke the tension, because he had decided in the first 5 minutes of the council that if someone did not break it, it would calcify into the kind of strategic paralysis that got armies destroyed. He leaned forward and addressed Jon Snow directly, cutting across the political geometry of the room with the clean precision of a man who respected competence and had identified where it Saturday. "Your defensive perimeter," he said, "has a weakness on the eastern approach. The trebuchets cover the north and west adequately, but the eastern wall relies on the natural terrain as a deterrent. Against a living army, that is sufficient. Against dead men who feel no fear and register no instinct to avoid difficult ground." He shook his head. "It will not hold past the first hour." The room was briefly silent. Jon looked at his commanders. One of them, a weathered man with the bearing of a professional soldier, gave a fractional nod that confirmed the assessment. "We know," Jon said. "We don't have enough men to shore it up and maintain the other positions." "Then redistribute," Boromir said. "Thin the western approach by 30% and reinforce the east with the difference. The western terrain will slow the dead sufficiently that the reduced force can compensate. The eastern wall cannot compensate for what it will face with current numbers." He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who had grown up in a city that had spent centuries perfecting the art of holding walls against impossible odds. and it landed in the room with the particular authority of practical knowledge, delivered without ego. Lionel Mormorn looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. "You've defended walls before," she said. "My entire life," Boromir said. "It is the primary qualification of a Gondorian captain." Jon Snow and Boromir spent the next hour rebuilding the Eastern defensive plan from first principles, with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of two soldiers who had found in each other the rarest of things in a room full of politics, someone who spoke the same language. They argued twice, once over the placement of reserve cavalry, once over the use of fire trenches, and both arguments were resolved quickly, because both men were more interested in being correct than in being right, which is a distinction that matters enormously in military planning, and almost nowhere else. Daenerys watched this with an expression that moved over the course of the hour, from suspicion through reluctant reassessment to something that was not quite trust but was at least its geographical neighbor. She asked 3 pointed questions about dragonglass distribution, received 3 precise answers from Aragorn, and by the end of the council, had angled her chair 2 degrees further toward the Fellowship's side of the room. It was not an alliance, but it was the beginning of the conditions under which an alliance might become possible. Gandalf noticed. He noticed everything. As the council broke and the lords and commanders filed out into the cold grey morning to implement plans that would determine whether anything in the north survived the next 48 hours, Sansa Stark appeared at Boromir's shoulder. She was quieter than her sister, more careful, with the specific patience of someone who had learned to wait for the right moment, with the thoroughness of a woman who had survived by reading rooms correctly. "The Eastern Wall," she said quietly. "You saw it immediately." "I was trained to see it," Boromir said. "Most of the lords who came to Winterfell were trained to see it too," Sansa said. "None of them mentioned it." She looked at him with the measuring assessment that was apparently a Stark family trait. "Why?" Boromir considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because most lords," he said finally, "are more afraid of appearing ignorant than of losing. Where I come from, we learned a long time ago that the wall either holds or it doesn't, and no amount of pride changes which one it is." Sansa Stark looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded. Once, with the careful economy of a woman who had spent years learning not to give her trust easily and had therefore made each instance of it count. "Stay close to Jon," she said. "He needs people around him who say what they mean." She glanced toward the door through which Daenerys had departed. "He doesn't always have enough of them." She left before he could respond. Boromir stood in the emptying great hall of Winterfell and looked at the map still spread across the table, with its markers and its positions and its careful, insufficient accounting of the forces arrayed against the living, and felt, for the first time since arriving in this world, the specific and clarifying weight of a purpose that fit the shape of his particular skills. There was a wall to defend. He knew how to defend walls. He rolled up his sleeves and went to find Jon Snow. Legolas left Winterfell before sunrise on the second day, slipping through the eastern gate in the grey pre-dawn dark with the soundless, particular ease of a being who had been moving through dangerous forests since before the kingdoms of men had names. He went alone, initially. Then Tormund, Giantsbane, found him at the tree line and fell into step beside him with the cheerful, uncomplicated aggression of a free folk raider who had decided that anything strange enough to unsettle the crows was worth following into the dark. They made an unlikely pair. Tormund was enormous, loud in the specific way of a man who had spent his life in open wilderness where volume was a social virtue, and moved through the snow with the heavy, ground-eating efficiency of someone built for endurance over elegance. Legolas moved the way light moves across water, without apparent effort, leaving no tracks, his elven eyes already reading the forest ahead of them as a continuous text of information that Tormund could access only in fragments. They did not speak for the first mile. Communication, in the wilderness, rarely requires it. Tormund had brought 6 of his best scouts, hard men and women, free folk through and through, who bent the knee to nothing and had survived beyond the wall long enough to develop the specific, granular expertise in frozen terrain that the Night's Watch had spent centuries trying to systematize, and never quite managed. They spread out in a loose formation, moving north, following a route that Tormund had scouted twice before and had described to the council in terms so geographically precise that Boromir had quietly revised his assessment of free folk military intelligence upward by a significant margin. The army of the dead was not where the last report had placed it. Legolas knew this before Tormund's scouts confirmed it, because his elven senses had been reaching outward since they left the tree line, reading the landscape with a sensitivity that no human instrument could match. He felt the wrongness of the dead's presence the way he felt weather, not as a single point of information but as a quality of the air itself, a texture, a temperature that had nothing to do with actual cold. The dead carried their own atmosphere, a stillness that was not peace, a silence that was not quiet. They've moved faster than your reports indicated, he said to Tormund. They are closer than 2 days. Tormund looked at him with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by strange things approximately 3 years ago. How much closer? Legolas was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the northern horizon with the particular, extended focus of elven sight reaching to its limit. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy with snow that had not yet fallen, and against it, at a distance that would have been invisible to human eyes, he could see. He was quiet for longer than Tormund found comfortable. Talk, the free folk leader said. I am counting, Legolas said. Counting what? The dead. A pause. I have been counting for some time and I have not reached the end of them. The scouts exchanged glances. Tormund said nothing, because he was a man who understood that some information needed a moment to sit before you could carry it properly. They pressed further north, to a ridgeline that Tormund's people knew, and that gave a clear sight line across the snowfields below. They went on their stomachs through the last 50 yards, because the instinct to stay low, before a vast enemy force, is one of those military principles that transcends the boundary between worlds. Legolas did not need to go on his stomach. His eyes had already told him what lay below, but he did it anyway, because he understood that the value of this moment was not the information itself but the witnessing of it, and that Tormund and his scouts needed to see it with their own eyes. What lay across the snowfields below the ridge was the army of the dead in its full and terrible enormity. They stretched from the tree line on the western edge of the valley to the frozen river on the east, an unbroken mass of dead humanity moving with the slow, inexorable patience of a tide, whites in their tens of thousands, moving in silence broken only by the sound of dead feet on frozen ground, a sound like the world's largest and most terrible drumbeat. Among them, larger shapes, giants, dead and reanimated, their bulk moving through the mass of whites like boulders through water, and above, circling in the iron sky with the specific, wrongful grace of something that should not fly, the dead dragon, Viserion, though none of the fellowship knew that name yet, trailing frost from its wings and blue fire from its ruined throat. One of Tormund's scouts made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when the scale of something exceeds the capacity of language to process it and the body attempts to compensate. Tormund said nothing. He lay on the ridge and he looked at the army that was going to reach Winterfell not in 2 days but in 1, and his expression moved through several things: fear, which he had the honesty to feel and the discipline not to surrender to, and rage, which came naturally, and finally a kind of cold, clear resolve that was the free folk's particular answer to impossible odds. They had lived beyond the wall. They had always known this was coming. They had bent the knee and crossed the wall and warned the crows until their voices were raw. And here it was. Here it was. We need to go back, Tormund said. Yes, Legolas agreed. They went back faster than they had come. and the scouts did not speak for the entire journey, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. It was Legolas who broke it. When Winterfell's walls were visible through, the trees and the gate guards had spotted them and were already opening the eastern gate. "The dead dragon," he said to Tormund. "It flies patrol patterns, consistent ones, north to east to north again, approximately every 40 minutes. He had been watching it the entire time on the ridge, timing it with the internal clock that elven consciousness maintained with unconscious precision. There is a window in its pattern, approximately 8 minutes, when it does not cover the southern approach." Tormund looked at him. "You're saying we could get something in from the south during that window?" "I am saying the window exists," Legolas said. "What is done with it is a question for the council." They went through the gate and into Winterfell's courtyard, and the gate closed behind them, and Legolas went immediately to find Gandalf, because what he had seen on the ridge was the kind of information that needed the specific quality of intelligence that Gandalf brought to bear on impossible situations, not optimism, precisely, but the long-practiced capacity to look at a scale of threat that would paralyze ordinary minds and find, within it, the structural weakness that ordinary minds could not perceive. He found the wizard in the Great Hall, sitting across from Jon Snow and Sir Davos and speaking in the low, focused tones of a conversation that had been going on for some time. Aragorn was there too, standing by the fire with Anduril unsheathed and resting across his knees, which was not, Legolas knew, a gesture of aggression but of the particular meditative focus that they, Dunedain, used to center themselves before significant events. The hall went quiet when Legolas entered. His expression was enough. "They are 1 day out," he said. "Not 2. And their numbers," he paused. And in the pause was the weight of everything he had seen on the ridge, compressed into the space before language. "Their numbers are beyond anything your scouts reported. The count was underestimated significantly." He looked at Gandalf. "We have tonight. That is all." The fire crackled. Somewhere above the hall, a raven called once and was silent. Jon Snow closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he opened them, and in them was the specific, terrible clarity of a man who has been handed the worst possible news and has decided that the only available response is to meet it standing up. "Then we use tonight," he said. "Every hour of it." He stood, and the Council of Winterfell reformed itself around the urgent, desperate, necessary business of surviving until dawn. The long night fell on Winterfell like a held breath finally released. It came not as darkness. The sky had been iron grey for 2 days, the sun a pale suggestion behind cloud cover that the Night King's advance seemed to drag with it, like a cloak, but as a quality of cold that was different from ordinary winter cold in the same way that silence in an empty room is different from silence in a room where something is waiting. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of an hour. The fires in the courtyard braziers guttered and struggled, and the ones nearest the northern wall went out entirely, not blown by wind but simply extinguished, as though the cold had reached a precise and intentional finger into each flame and pinched it off. The Dothraki rode first. Melisandre stood on the walls and lit their arcs with raw fire, and for one extraordinary moment the darkness to the north was filled with 10,000 burning blades, a river of fire moving into the black, and even Gandalf on the battlements was briefly, genuinely moved by it, the specific, heart-breaking beauty of a brave and doomed charge into a darkness that did not retreat from fire or fear or the thundering courage of horse lords who had never known defeat. The light moved north. It diminished. It went out, one blade at a time, until there was nothing but darkness and the sound of the dead coming. Then the dead reached the walls. Gimli had been waiting for this with the focused, professional patience of a dwarf who had fought in Moria, who had stood at Helm's Deep through a night that had seemed equally unsurvivable, and who had developed across those experiences a working philosophy about impossible last stands. You did not think about the scale of what was coming. You thought about the next axe swing. You thought about the enemy immediately in front of you. You made that enemy dead, or in this case, more dead than it already was, and then you thought about the next one. The mathematics of survival, reduced to the only unit of measurement that mattered. He fought on the northern battlements, with 2 of Winterfell's best soldiers flanking him, and he was magnificent. The whites came over the walls on grappling hooks of bone and frozen rope, and Gimli met them, with Erebor steel swung with dwarven strength, and the particular savage joy of a creature built for close quarters combat facing an enemy that came to him in exactly the geometry he preferred. He took heads and limbs with equal facility, his axe moving in the torchlight with a speed that the northern soldiers beside him struggled to track. And when the first section of battlements was cleared, he moved immediately to the second without pause, without ceremony, stepping over the re-dead whites with the matter-of-fact practicality of a dwarf who had somewhere more important to be. Keep up, he told the soldiers flanking him. They kept up. Boromir held the eastern gate. This was where the Fellowship's restructured defensive plan mattered most, because the eastern approach had delivered exactly what Boromir had predicted, a volume of whites that the original positioning would not have survived past the first hour. The reinforced eastern gate held, but only because Boromir was there, directing the spearmen, calling the trebuchet adjustments, personally holding the gate mechanism, when a white broke through the outer barricade, and 3 men died trying to push it back. He fought with his sword in one hand and his shield as a weapon in the other, the Gondorian style that prioritized the shield as an offensive instrument, as much as a defensive one, and the soldiers around him responded to his presence the way soldiers always respond to a commander who fights beside them rather than behind them. They held longer than they should have been able to. He took a gash across his left forearm from a white's bone blade in the second hour. He wrapped it himself, one-handed, without stopping directing the gate defense, and kept fighting. Aragorn rode. He had taken a northern horse, a big, cold country animal that had been trained for battle, and was managing the presence of the dead with the trembling, white-eyed determination of a creature that was terrified, but trusted its rider, and he rode the perimeter of Winterfell's outer defensive line with Anduril raised, moving where the line was breaking, lending his strength and his blade and the specific, galvanizing quality of his presence to the points of greatest crisis. He was not the Lord Commander of this battle. That was Jon Snow, who fought on the outer walls with the ferocity of a man who had died once and found the experience educational. But Aragorn moved through the battle with the authority of someone who had spent decades as a ranger, operating without support, making independent tactical judgments in the dark, and his interventions were precise and timely in the way that only genuine battlefield experience produces. He spoke to soldiers as he passed them, not speeches. There was no time for speeches, and he had never been a man who confused rhetoric with leadership. Single sentences, a name when he knew it, which was more often than anyone expected, because he had spent the previous day learning the names of every unit. Commander on the Winterfell defensive roster. You fight better for someone who knows your name. This is not sentiment. It is military psychology, ancient and reliable. Above the battle, Jon and Daenerys rode their dragons. Rhaegal and Drogon tore through the dead's formations on the northern approach with dragonfire that lit the long night in pulses of orange and gold, and the dead burned and the living on the walls cheered. And for a while, for a terrible, brief, beautiful while, it seemed as though the plan might hold. The dragons were the great equalizer. Against a ground army, even one of this size, 2 living dragons were sufficient to prevent the catastrophic collapse that pure numerical advantage would otherwise guarantee. Then Viserion came out of the clouds. Legolas saw it first. He had been tracking the dead dragon's patrol pattern since he returned from the ridge, timing its movements, waiting for the southern approach window he had identified. He had communicated the pattern to Gandalf and to Jon and had positioned himself on the highest point of Winterfell's walls with his bow and a quiver of dragon glass-tipped arrows that the Winterfell smiths had produced in the previous nights. Frantic manufacturing effort, an improvisation that might work and might not, and was the best available option in the absence of Valyrian steel arrows, which did not exist. Viserion came out of the clouds above the eastern wall with the Night King on its back, and it opened its throat, and what came out was not fire but cold blue light, not flame but its absence, a jet of absolute freezing that was the visual representation of the Night King's fundamental nature, made physical and weaponized and aimed at the eastern wall where Boromir's men were holding the gate. Legolas drew and released in the same motion, without conscious thought, the way 10,000 hours of practice collapses the distance between intention and action to nothing. The dragonglass arrow crossed the distance to Viserion in less than a second and struck the dead dragon in the left wing joint, punching through dead membrane, and Viserion shrieked, a sound like ice fracturing across an entire lake, and the blue jet went wide, scorching the eastern battlements but missing the gate mechanism by 30 feet. It was enough. Boromir's gate held. Viserion banked away, and Legolas tracked it with a second arrow and a third, each one finding dead flesh. None of them fatal. The dead dragon was vast, and his arrows were not designed for this specific purpose, and he knew it. But slowing it, disrupting it, buying the seconds that Drogon needed to intercept and drive it back into the clouds in a collision of living fire and dead cold that lit the sky above. Winterfell like a second dawn. On the walls, the living held. They bled and they died and they held. In the great hall below, which had been converted into a field hospital in the hours before the battle, Sam moved between the wounded with the focused, compassionate competence of a hobbit who had read every medical text in the Winterfell library in the preceding 24 hours and applied its contents with the specific, practical intelligence of someone who understood that knowledge divorced from application is merely comfort. He was not a healer by training. He was a healer by the particular combination of intelligence and care that makes training, in the end, almost secondary. Merry and Pippin were in the crypts. They had gone there with 40 civilians, mostly women and children and their elderly, under the direction of Sir Davos, who had taken Gandalf's warning with the seriousness it deserved and had quietly, efficiently, without alarming anyone, redistributed the crypt population to the great hall's upper levels and positioned the 2 hobbits at the crypt entrance with short swords of dragon glass-edged Westerosi steel that the Winterfell armor had produced at Gandalf's specific request. They were there when the dead began to stir in the stone. The crypts of Winterfell woke slowly, the way old things wake, not with the sudden violence of a breaking wave but with the gradual, terrible accumulation of wrongness that builds in the dark when no one is watching. The iron swords at the feet of the dead Stark kings had been cold for centuries. Now they were colder. The torches along the crypt walls guttered in a wind that had no source. The carved stone faces of the kings of winter seemed, in the shifting light, to move. Merry noticed first. He had always been the more analytically inclined of the two. Pippin was braver in the immediate physical sense, quicker to act. But Merry read situations with a patience and precision that had made him, in another life and another world, the architect of the Shire's defense against Saruman's industrial occupation. He noticed the quality of the silence change. He noticed the frost forming on the stone walls moving upward rather than down, which was not how frost behaved. He noticed, in the furthest reach of the torchlight, a carved stone hand on a dead king's effigy slowly, incrementally, close into a fist. "Pip," he said quietly. "I see it," Pippin said. He had his short sword drawn already, which was either prescience or the particular hobbit instinct for trouble that had been thoroughly developed by their shared experiences in Fangorn, Isengard, and the siege of Minas Tirith. "I see all of it." They had 40 civilians behind them, and a stone corridor in front of them and no reinforcements coming, because every able-bodied fighter above them was occupied with the 10,000 dead things pressing against Winterfell's walls. They had each other, their dragon glass-edged blades, and the specific remarkable quality that hobbits of the Shire develop through the combination of a gentle upbringing and extreme adversarial circumstances, a refusal, at the level of fundamental character, to be defeated by things larger than themselves. It was not courage in the formal sense. It was something more stubborn and more durable than courage. The first dead king rose from his alcove with the grinding sound of stone and centuries, and Merry and Pippin met it together. The dragon-glass edges on their blades worked. This was the first and most important discovery. Confirmed in the first 3 seconds of contact, dragonglass killed whites. And the dead Stark Kings were whites now, reanimated by the Night King's power as it intensified above them. And the dragonglass edges found dead flesh and did what dragonglass was made to do. The dead king collapsed. A second rose. Then a third. The crypt corridor filled with the grinding cacophony of stone effigies shifting in there. Alcoves as the dead answered the Night King's call. And the 2 hobbits stood in the torchlight and held the line with the compact, economical ferocity of people who had no alternative. Behind them, the civilians pressed against the far wall. A child was crying. Someone was praying to the old gods in a rapid, barely audible whisper. Merry heard all of it and filed it away in the part of his mind that tracked the human cost of what was happening, the part he would process later when there was time, and kept fighting. Pippin took a cut across his right cheek from a dead king's stone-hard fingers. He shook the blood from his eye and kept fighting. They held the crypt entrance for 20 minutes. It was one of the finest 20 minutes of fighting that neither of them would ever be able to fully explain to anyone who had not been there. Above, in the battle's 4th hour, Gandalf moved. He had been on the northern battlements since the dead reached the walls. And he had not been idle. His staff had blazed with the white light that he had used on the bridge of Khazad-dûm and on the fields of the Pelennor, the Maya light that drove back shadow and broke the courage of dark things. And it had worked on the whites with a gratifying consistency, the dead recoiling from it with the specific, instinctive revulsion of corrupted things, encountering a power that predated and superseded their masters. He had held his section of the northern wall almost unassisted, his light sweeping the battlements clean in pulses that the northern soldiers had initially mistaken for wildfire before they realized it was something older and considerably more directed. But he had been waiting, reading the battle the way he had read battles across 3 ages of Middle-earth, not as a participant seeking personal glory, but as a strategic intelligence, seeking the moment when his particular nature could accomplish what no sword or dragon could. He had felt the Night King's power intensifying throughout the battle's progress, felt it the way he felt weather, as a pressure and a temperature and a quality of the air. And he had felt, in the last hour, something shift in that power, a focusing, a concentration, a gathering of the Night King's attention toward a specific point, toward the godswood. He found Jon Snow on the inner wall and spoke quickly and without preamble, because there was no time for anything else. The Night King is not on his dragon. He has come down. He is moving toward your godswood, and I believe I understand why. He looked at Jon with the focused intensity of a Maya, intelligence that had spent 3,000 years learning to recognize the structural logic of dark powers, the weirwood tree, the heart tree, its connection to the old gods, to the psychic network of greenseer consciousness that runs beneath this land. If he corrupts it, if he turns that network to his purpose. He did not finish the sentence, because the conclusion was sufficiently obvious and there was no time. Jon Snow's face showed, for one unguarded moment, the full weight of everything, the battle, the dead, the impossible mathematics of survival. And now this. Then it closed back into the particular, hard-won composure that was his primary leadership tool. "I'll go," he said. "We will go," Gandalf said. "Together. What I can do in the godswood will require time I do not have if I am also fighting alone. And you," he looked at Jon with the specific, evaluating gaze of someone who had spent a great deal of time in proximity to people touched by destiny and had developed an accurate sense of what it looked like. "You are necessary to this in ways that go beyond your sword. Jon looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man who was tired of being told he was necessary and would have preferred to simply be ordinary and alive. Then he turned to Sir Davos, who was at his shoulder as always, and said 3 words. "Hold the walls." Davos, who had been holding things together through worse moments than this, with less support than this, nodded once with the unflappable, practical grace of a man who had made a career of making the impossible workable. They went through the inner gate and into the godswood. The ancient wood was transformed. The weirwood heart tree stood at its center as it always had, its white bark and red leaves vivid even in the darkness. Its carved face, the face that had watched the Starks for 10,000 years, twisted now with a wrongness that had not been there before. The red of the leaves had deepened to something darker. The roots, usually still, moved slightly in the earth, a slow and terrible animation. And standing before it, in the silence at the center of the battle's chaos, was the Night King. He was exactly as Jon had described. Him and entirely unlike what Gandalf had expected. Tall, pale, armored in ice that had grown from his flesh rather than been placed upon it, with eyes like the last light before absolute cold takes everything. He turned when they entered the godswood with the unhurried, patient attention of something that did not experience surprise because surprise required the capacity for expectation. And the Night King expected nothing because he had already decided that everything would end. He looked at Jon Snow with the flat, ancient recognition of a being that had been created to destroy a specific threat and had tracked that threat across centuries. Then he looked at Gandalf, and for the first time in the long night, something moved in those blue-white eyes that was not vacancy, not surprise. That capacity was genuinely gone. But something, recognition, perhaps, the specific, cold awareness of a darkness that had encountered a light it could not immediately categorize, and was, in its ancient and alien way, recalibrating. Gandalf raised his staff. The godswood filled with white light. The Night King raised one hand, and the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant, and the light and the cold met in the space between them and held, neither advancing, both absolute. The oldest possible argument made physical, warmth against extinction, light against the void. And the weirwood heart tree groaned in its roots as the two powers contested its ancient connection to the world beneath. Jon Snow moved left, circling, longclaw in hand, looking for the angle. Above them, through the canopy of the godswood, the sounds of the battle continued. Dragonfire, human voices, the endless grinding percussion of the dead against the walls. Thousands of lives balanced on what happened in the next minutes in this ancient wood. Gandalf held the light and held it, pouring into it the full depth of his Maya nature, everything he was beneath, the aging flesh and the grey robes and the carefully maintained appearance of a wandering old man, and felt the Night King's cold pressing back against it with the patient, inexhaustible power of something that had been building toward this moment for 8,000 years. He could not hold it indefinitely. That was the truth. He had known since he felt the Night King's power in the crypts 2 nights ago. He was not Sauron's equal and the Night King was not Sauron. But the Night King was ancient, in a way that intersected badly with the specific nature of Gandalf's power, which was a power of inspiration and resistance and the kindling of courage in others rather than the raw, overwhelming force that the situation seemed to demand. He was buying time. He was very good at buying time. Jon Snow needed to use it. Jon Snow had died before. This was not a metaphor. He had felt the specific, sequential failure of a body losing its blood, had felt the cold of the castle black courtyard coming up through the stone beneath him, had felt the particular narrowing of consciousness that precedes final darkness, had felt the last breath leave him with the unceremonious finality of a thing simply stopping. He had died, and he had come back. And what the experience had given him, beyond the obvious theological complications, was a relationship with mortal fear that was fundamentally different from the one he'd had before. He had met the worst outcome. He knew its dimensions, and knowing them, he had discovered made the approach toward them navigable in a way that pure survival instinct never quite managed. He moved left through the godswood with Longclaw low and his eyes on the Night King. And he was afraid. And the fear was useful because he had learned to use it rather than fight it. And he circled with the patient, systematic focus of a fighter, who had been trained by one of the finest swordsmen in Westeros and had supplemented that training with the kind of practical, adversarial experience that no formal instruction can replicate. The Night King watched him with the blue-white vacancy of those ancient eyes and did not move. This was the problem. The Night King's attention was divided. Gandalf's light was demanding the full weight of his power to resist, and Jon could see the contest of it in the way the air between the wizard and the ancient enemy shimmered and fractured, warm and cold, fighting for the same cubic feet of godswood, air with an intensity that made the bark of the surrounding trees crack and split. Gandalf was holding, barely, and at what cost Jon could only guess, but holding. The white light blazed and the cold pressed and neither moved. But the Night King, even divided, was not vulnerable in the way Jon needed him to be. He stood before the weirwood heart tree with the specific, settled authority of something that had chosen its ground and knew it was unassailable. Because the Night King's vulnerability was not positional. It was not a question of approach angle or tactical geometry. It was a question of the right weapon in the right hand at the right moment. And Longclaw was Valyrian steel, which could kill whites and white walkers alike. But whether it could kill the Night King himself was a question that Jon had been carrying since the moment he first understood what the Night King was, and it had no confirmed answer. He was still circling when Aragorn came through the godswood entrance. He came at a run, which was the first indication that something had changed in the battle outside. And the second indication was the blood on his sword arm and the controlled urgency in his expression. Aragorn did not run unless running was the correct tactical choice. And he was running now. "The eastern gate is holding," he said to Jon without preamble, taking in the tableau in the godswood, the Night King, the blazing wizard, the contested heart tree, with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of a ranger who had spent decades processing dangerous situations quickly. Boromir is wounded but standing. Gimli has the northern battlements. Legolas has driven Viserion back 3 times. He stopped beside Jon and looked at the Night King with the evaluating gaze of a man who had stood before the Nazgul on Weathertop and on the fields of the Pelennor and had learned, across those experiences, to read the specific quality of ancient, dark power. Gandalf cannot hold that indefinitely. "I know," Jon said. "Then we need to end this now." Aragorn looked at Longclaw, then at Andriel. Together. Jon looked at him. Aragorn looked back. In that exchange was the compressed communication of 2 commanders who had arrived, independently, at the same military conclusion, that the geometry of the situation required both of them moving in coordination from opposing angles, forcing the Night King to divide his attention in a way that fighting a single opponent did not require. It was not a complicated plan. The best plans rarely are. They split apart, Jon continuing left, Aragorn moving right, both circling the Night King from opposite sides with the patient, widening spiral of fighters who understood that the value of the maneuver lay in its accumulation, rather than its speed. The Night King tracked them both. His head moved between them with the slow, mechanical precision of a being processing threat vectors, rather than experiencing combat in any way that resembled human engagement with violence. Gandalf's light flared. It was not a controlled flare, it was the specific, desperate intensification of a power being pushed to its limit and responding by burning hotter rather than longer. And Jon recognized it for what it was without needing to look directly at the wizard. Gandalf was reaching the edge of what he could sustain. The window was closing. Jon and Aragorn moved at the same moment. Not because they had signaled each other. There had been no signal, no agreed cue, no predetermined trigger. They moved because they had both, independently, felt the moment arrive, which is the rarest and most valuable quality in a fighting partnership and cannot be trained into existence but only recognized when it appears. Jon came from the left with Longclaw raised, in the high guard that his training called for and his instinct refined, driving toward the Night King's left side with the committed, full-weight attack of a fighter who had decided that hesitation was the only luxury he could not afford. Aragorn came from the right with Anduril, Flame of the West, reforged from the shards of Narsil, the sword that had cut the One Ring from Sauron's hand in the last age of Middle-earth, in the low-angled cut that the Dunedain called the River Stroke, aimed at the Night King's right flank with the controlled, devastating precision of a man who had been training for exactly this kind of moment since he was old enough to hold a blade. The Night King moved. He was fast, faster than something that appeared to operate at the temperature of absolute stillness had any right to be, and he was strong in a way that had nothing to do with muscle or training and everything to do with the specific, fundamental nature of a power that had been building in the cold for 8,000 years. He caught Jon's blade on a forearm that had become, over millennia, harder than the ice it resembled, and the impact sent a shockwave of cold up Longclaw's blade that Jon felt through his gauntlets and into his hands, not quite enough to lose the sword, but enough to understand that a sustained exchange on these terms would end in one way. But Anduril reached him. Aragorn's river stroke connected with the Night King's right side, Valyrian quality steel meeting ice armor, and the sound it made was not the sound of sword on steel or sword on stone, but something else, a crack, a resonance, a frequency of impact that seemed to travel outward from the point of contact through the air and the ground, and the roots of the weirwood tree simultaneously. The Night King staggered. It was a small stagger, 2 inches, perhaps 3, but it was real, and it was the first time in the long night that Jon Snow had seen the Night King moved by anything a living person had done. Gandalf saw it too. In the fractional instant of the Night King's disruption, the wizard's light surged forward, not the sustained blazing contest of the previous minutes, but a concentrated, directed pulse of pure Maya power aimed not at the Night King's body but at the connection between the Night King and the Heart Tree, the dark filament of corrupted old god's magic that the ancient enemy had been weaving through the weirwoods roots since he entered the godswood. The filament broke. The Heart Tree shuddered. The carved face on its pale trunk shifted. The expression that had always seemed to hover between sorrow and patience moving suddenly into something that might, in a different context, have been called relief. The red leaves blazed with a light that was not Gandalf's light and not the Night King's cold, but something older than both, the old gods themselves, roused from whatever dreaming they did in the deep roots of the world, responding to the intrusion on their domain with the slow, enormous displeasure of powers that did not act quickly, but acted with the full weight of 10,000 years. When they finally chose to act, the Night King turned toward the Heart Tree with the first thing that had resembled urgency in his ancient bearing. Jon Snow stepped forward and drove Longclaw toward the Night King's chest. The blade struck true, but the Night King was turning, and the angle was wrong, and what should have been a killing blow landed instead at the left side of his chest, punching through ice armor and into the cold flesh beneath, and the Night King's hand came up and caught Jon by the throat with a grip that was the physical manifestation of winter itself. And Jon felt the cold entering him through that grip, not ordinary cold but the specific, existential cold of the Night King's nature, reaching through flesh and toward whatever it was that animated living things and trying to extinguish it. Aragorn's second strike came a half-second later. Anduril took the Night King across the back of the hand that held Jon's throat, and the grip broke, not because the hand was severed, though the blade cut deep, but because the resonance of Narsil steel, reforged in the fires of Rivendell by elven hands that understood the specific metallurgical properties of Valyrian adjacent craftsmanship in ways that no Westerosi smith had ever accessed, interacted with the Night King's iceflesh in a way that was not purely physical. There was a quality to the impact that Aragorn felt, through the blade and into the hilt, and into his hands, a vibration, a wrongness being disturbed, the specific sensation of a power encountering something it had not accounted for. Jon fell to one knee. The cold in his chest was extraordinary. He had been cold before, he had died in the cold, but this was different. Intentional, a cold with a purpose. And he felt it reaching, and could not immediately stop it reaching. And the godswood swam in his vision with the specific, alarming quality of a world beginning to recede. Then warmth. It came from the heart tree, through the ground, through the roots, through the stone beneath the godswood floor, a pulse of warmth. That was the old gods, asserting their domain over the corrupted. Cold the Night King had tried to thread through their network, and it moved through Jon's knees and into his body and pushed the cold back with the patient, enormous authority of a power that had claimed this ground 10,000 years before the Night King walked it. Jon's vision cleared. He looked up. The Night King stood 8 feet away, and for the first time, he was not moving toward something. He was standing still in the way that things stand still when multiple forces are contesting their ability to move. And in the blue-white vacancy of his eyes was something that Gandalf, recovering against the heart tree with his staff for support, recognized with the particular, exhausted relief of someone who has been hoping for a specific development and has finally seen it arrive. The Night King was not winning. He was not losing either. But for the first time in 8,000 years, he was not winning, and the old gods were awake. And Gandalf's light was still burning. And Jon Snow was climbing back to his feet with Longclaw in his hand. Outside the godswood, the battle continued its terrible accounting. Frodo Baggins had not been in the godswood. He had been in the Great Hall, which Sam had converted into a field hospital with the organized, compassionate efficiency that was Sam's particular genius. And he had been helping, carrying water, holding hands, speaking quietly to the wounded in the specific, unhurried way that hobbits spoke, without false comfort but with the genuine warmth of a creature whose fundamental nature was oriented toward the living rather than the theoretical. He had done this through the battle's first hours with the focused, present tense attention of someone who had learned in the fires of Mordor that the most important thing, in any moment of extremity, was the person directly in front of you. But the ring had been speaking. It had been speaking since they arrived in Winterfell. Since the first moment, Gandalf had extended his Maya senses northward and felt the Night King's power, and the quality of that power had passed through the wizard's awareness and into the ambient atmosphere of the godswood and through the walls and into the great hall and found Frodo, found the ring on its chain against his chest. And the ring had recognized something in that power that it wanted to reach toward. This was the nature of the One Ring. It sought power. It was drawn toward power the way a compass needle is drawn toward north, not consciously, not with deliberate malice in any given moment, but with the deep, structural inevitability of a thing made for a specific purpose encountering the conditions that activated it. Sauron had made it to dominate, and the Night King's power over the dead was a form of domination so fundamental and so total that the ring vibrated with something that was not quite recognition but occupied the same emotional register. Frodo had felt it all night, had kept his hand away from the chain with the disciplined, exhausting effort of someone who had walked to the edge of the crack of doom, and back and understood, at a level below conscious thought, what the ring's whispering led toward. He went to the godswood because he felt the moment change. He could not have explained, afterward, what exactly he felt or how he felt it. The same way he could never fully explain the clarity that had come over him on the slope of Mount Doom. The moments when the ring's voice became suddenly louder and therefore, paradoxically, more legible, more possible to read as the thing it was rather than the thing it disguised itself as. He felt the Night King's power surge and then falter. Felt Gandalf's light blazing and the old gods stirring in the earth and Jon Snow climbing back to his feet. And he understood, not intellectually, but in the bone-deep way that the ring had always communicated with him, through sensation rather than reason, that what was happening in the godswood had reached a pivot point, a moment balanced on its own edge. And that the ring knew this and was pulling toward it with an intensity that was no longer subtle. He went because he needed to understand what the ring was being pulled toward. Because in his experience, the ring's desire was always the most important information available, even when, especially when, acting on it was the worst possible choice. Sam found him at the Godswood entrance. Mr. Frodo. Sam's voice carried every mile of every road they had walked together, all the way back to Bag End and the ordinary, irreplaceable world they had left there. You shouldn't be here. I know, Frodo said. He had his hand on the chain. Not pulling it over his head, not yet. Not that, but holding it through the fabric of his shirt with the specific grip of someone maintaining a connection they were not sure they should maintain. But Sam, the ring is, he stopped, started again. It can feel him, the Night King. It wants. I know what it wants, Sam said, with the flat, loving certainty of a hobbit who had carried the ring himself, briefly, and remembered every second of it. He put himself beside Frodo, not blocking him, not restraining him, but beside him, which was where he had always been and which was, in its own way, the most powerful thing Sam Gamgee had ever done. The question is what you want, Mr. Frodo. Frodo looked at him. In the Godswood entrance, with the ancient wood lit by Gandalf's blazing light and the sounds of the battle on the walls above and the specific, impossible weight of the ring against his chest, he looked at Samwise Gamgee, his gardener, his friend, his companion across every road that had mattered, and felt, as he had felt in the worst moments of their journey, that Sam's presence was the most reliable counterweight available to the ring's influence. Not because Sam was powerful, because Sam was real, in a way that the ring, for all its ancient cunning, could not replicate or replace. I want to help, Frodo said. I want to do something that matters. I have spent this whole battle carrying water and the ring has been getting louder and I need to know if there is something I can do with it that isn't. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Sam was quiet for a moment, his round, honest face working through the problem with the methodical patience that was his greatest quality. Then he said, Gandalf said the Night King's power has a source, like the ring has a source. Yes. And the ring knows about sources. Sam said it carefully, feeling the shape of the idea as he spoke it. It was made by one. It recognizes them. Frodo went very still. The idea that was forming between them was not safe. It was not sanctioned by any plan the council had made, and Gandalf had specifically said nothing to suggest it, and there was a meaningful chance that it was the ring itself generating the logic. That made it seem like a good idea, which was exactly the kind of reasoning the ring had used on wiser minds than theirs across its long and destructive history. But Frodo had stood on the edge of the crack of doom. He had felt what the ring's power, fully unleashed, could do to the architecture of a Dark Lord's existence. And what he was not proposing, what he was very carefully not proposing, was to use the ring. He was proposing something smaller and more specific, to bring it close enough to the Night King's connection to his source, that the ring's own hunger for power might work against the thing it was reaching toward, might disrupt rather than serve, might pull at the Night King's anchor to his ancient magic the way a magnet disrupts a compass. It might do nothing. It might make things worse. It was the kind of plan that had approximately no margin for error, and depended on an understanding of the ring's behavior that Frodo had developed through suffering rather than scholarship. He looked at Sam. Sam looked at him. Together, Sam said, they went into the Godswood. What they found was the Night King, standing in the space between Jon Snow and Aragorn with a specific quality of something that was being contested from multiple directions simultaneously. Gandalf's light at the heart tree, Jon and Aragorn with blades drawn on either side, the old gods stirring in the roots beneath. The Night King was not diminished, exactly, but he was contained, held in a moment that had not yet resolved. The pivot point Frodo had felt from the Great Hall balanced on its edge. The ring blazed against Frodo's chest. Not heat. It was never heat. Always the specific cold warmth of something that wanted and wanted and wanted. It blazed toward the Night King with an intensity that Frodo had felt only once before. On the slope of Mount Doom, when Sauron's attention had found him through it, the Night King turned. Those blue-eyed eyes found the ring with the same quality of attention they had given. Gandalf's light, not surprise, but recalibration. The specific, alien awareness of an ancient power encountering something it had not accounted for. The ring was not from this world. Its power was not from this world. And the Night King, who operated through the absolute, total dominion of his will over the dead things he commanded, found himself reaching toward it with the reflexive, structural hunger of a power that sought to subsume other powers, and found the ring reaching back, and the two hungers met in. The air between them and neither was what the other expected. Gandalf saw it happen. He understood it approximately 2 seconds after it began, which was fast enough. John. His voice cracked across the godswood like a physical thing, carrying the full authority of a Maya intelligence that had waited 3 long ages of the world for moments like this. Now, Jon Snow did not hesitate. He had learned, in the time since Gandalf had entered his life, that the wizard's timing was not arbitrary and that the moments he chose to act were chosen because they were the correct moments, and that hesitation in those moments was the only true failure available. He drove Longclaw forward with everything he had. The Night King's attention was divided, the ring pulling at him from Frodo's direction, Gandalf's light blazing at the Heart Tree connection, Aragorn moving on his right. And in that division was the fraction of an opening that Jon Snow had been trained his entire life to find and use. Longclaw's Valyrian steel blade found the Night King's chest. Found it true, found it at the angle. Found it with the full committed weight of a man who had died once and had decided, somewhere in the cold of Castle Black, that if he was going to die again he was going to do it moving forward. The Night King looked down at the blade. Then he looked at Jon Snow. And in those ancient, blue-white eyes, in the last moment before everything changed, was not rage and not fear but something that Gandalf would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for the specific, exhausted expression of something that has been cold for 8,000 years and has just, for the first time, felt something warmer than itself. Then he shattered. Not fell, shattered. The way ice shatters when the temperature changes too fast, from the inside out. Cracks racing through the frozen architecture of his body from the point where Longclaw had entered, and the cold that he was made of dispersing outward in a wave that Frodo felt as a sudden release of pressure against the rings. Hunger, the thing it had been, reaching towards simply ceasing to exist, and the ring's desire, suddenly finding nothing to reach toward and collapsing back against itself in the specific, disorienting way of an appetite without an object. Outside Winterfell's walls, the army of the dead stopped. They stopped all at once, not the way living soldiers stop, sequentially, with the communication of orders through ranks, but simultaneously, the way marionettes stop when the puppeteer's hand opens. Every wight on every approach to Winterfell stood motionless for one suspended moment, and then, one by one and then in thousands and then in the vast, uncountable whole of them, they fell. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Jon Snow had ever heard. In the godswood, the Heart Tree's carved face returned to its ancient expression, sorrow and patience, the permanent condition of the old gods, who had watched everything and forgotten nothing. The red leaves settled. The roots stilled. Gandalf lowered his staff and leaned on it with the particular, genuine exhaustion of a Maiar, who had burned very close to the edge of what his current form could sustain. Frodo sat down in the snow of the godswood and put his hand flat against the cold ground and breathed. Sam sat beside him, said nothing, put his hand over Frodo's. That was enough. Dawn came to Winterfell the way dawn comes after the worst nights, not triumphantly, not with the dramatic, golden proclamation that songs would later claim, but quietly, incrementally, a grey light that thickened slowly. in the east until it became something that could be called morning. The fires on the walls burned lower. The ravens that had been silent through the long night began, one by one, to call. And across the killing fields north of Winterfell, where the army of the dead had stood in its tens of thousands, there was nothing but snow, and the still, ordinary silence of a winter morning from which something vast and ancient and terrible had been removed. The living counted their dead. It took most of the morning. The maestas and the surviving soldiers moved through Winterfell's halls and courtyard, and the field hospital that Sam had run through the night. And the numbers were what the numbers were, significant, irreversible. The specific arithmetic of survival that leaves no room for revision or comfort. Houses that had come to Winterfell with 50 soldiers left with 30. Some left with fewer. The Dothraki, who had ridden into the darkness first, had ridden back in numbers that made Daenerys close her eyes for a long moment when Jorah Mormont brought her the count, and she did not open them again for longer than anyone in the room felt comfortable acknowledging. But Winterfell stood. The fellowship gathered in the great hall as the morning progressed, drawn together by the specific gravity of people who have survived something extreme and find, in the aftermath, that proximity to the others who survived it is the only available comfort. They were battered in the specific, comprehensive way of fighters, who had held an impossible line through an impossible night. Gimli had 3 cracked ribs and a gash across his left forearm that Sam had stitched with the focused, careful competence that had characterized everything Sam did that night. Boromir's arm wound had deepened during the gate defense and would leave a scar that he would carry for the rest of his life, which was the kind of accounting Boromir had always understood and accepted. Legolas, who did not bleed the way mortals bled, nonetheless moved, with the careful deliberateness of someone in whom something had shifted. Not physical damage, but the specific, elven form of exhaustion that came from sustained contact with a darkness that predated even Mirkwood's long memory. Merry and Pippin had held the crypts. When the Whites fell with the Night King's death, they had stood in the crypt entrance in the sudden, complete silence and looked at each other, with the expression of people checking to confirm that the other was still real. Pippin's cheek had been cleaned and dressed by Sam, who had looked at the cut with the critical eye of a hobbit who had read 3 medical texts in 24 hours and declared it superficial with a thoroughness that suggested he had needed to confirm this for his own peace of mind as much as Pippin's. Frodo sat at the long table in the great hall and did not speak for a long time. The ring lay against his chest on its chain, and it was quiet, quieter than it had been since they arrived in this world, quieter perhaps than it had been since they left the Shire. He did not know whether this was because the Night King's absence had removed something the ring had been reaching toward, or whether the experience in the Godswood had temporarily exhausted its influence, or whether something more fundamental had shifted in the ring's relationship to this particular world. He was aware that all 3 possibilities had different implications and that the distinction between them mattered enormously. He would talk to Gandalf about it later. Gandalf sat at the far end of the table with his pipe. He had located pipeweed of adequate though not exceptional quality in Winterfell's stores the previous day, which had seemed to him then and seemed to him now one of the more reliable indicators that the world they had landed in was not entirely without its compensations. And he smoked in the specific, contemplative silence of someone processing an enormous amount of information at a pace that could not be rushed. He had spent his power in the Godswood at a depth that required genuine recovery, and the recovery was happening now, slowly, in the warmth of the Great Hall's fires. He was old. He had been old in Middle-earth, and he was old here, and the oldness was a different quality now than it had been before the Godswood, not diminished, but clarified, the way metal is clarified by the specific stress of a serious test. Jon Snow found them there. He came alone, without Daenerys, or Sansa or Davos or any of the apparatus of governance that had surrounded him since they arrived. and he sat at the table with the fellowship with the particular, unguarded quality of a man who had set down the weight of command for a few minutes and was allowing himself to simply be in the room with people he had fought beside. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had not slept and did not expect to sleep for some time yet, because surviving a battle created its own administrative enormity and the administrative enormity of surviving this battle was going to occupy weeks. He looked at each of them in turn. The wizard with his pipe, the ranger with Andril laid flat on the table before him, the elf, still and careful in the morning light, the dwarf, bandaged and watchful, the soldier, forearm wrapped and expression composed, the four hobbits, scattered along the bench with the specific, compact solidarity of creatures who had faced something enormous and were now sitting close together because close together was what they knew. The realm owes you a debt, Jon said, that I don't have the words for. Debts between fighters are settled on the field, Boromir said, with the directness that had become, over the past 2 days, the primary currency of his relationship with the North. We were there. We fought. That is the whole of it. Jon looked at Gandalf. What happens now? It was the question Gandalf had been sitting with since dawn. He had been feeling the edges of it since the Night King shattered in the Godswood, feeling the rift that had brought them here, which he could sense as a presence in the ambient magical atmosphere of Winterfell, the way he could sense the weirwood network and the residual raw fire and all the other magical threads that ran through this world like roots through soil. The rift was still there. It had not closed. Whether it would close, and when, and whether its closure would strand them here, permanently or dissolve their connection to this world entirely, were questions he could not yet answer with confidence. The passage that brought us here remains open, he said carefully. For how long, I cannot say with certainty. It is a function of forces I understand. Incompletely, the glass candle ritual that summoned us here created a connection between worlds, and the events of the long night have changed the magical atmosphere of this world in ways that affect that connection's stability. He looked at Jon. I believe we could return. I also believe that if we do not move toward the passage within the next few days, it may close beyond our ability to reopen it. The great hall was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the ravens called in the cold morning air. Then you should go, Jon said. He said it with the specific, unadorned generosity of a man who understood loss and had decided that another person's need outweighed his own. Your world needs you back. Our world, Aragorn said slowly, may be well. The War of the Ring is not yet concluded in our time, but its conclusion does not depend entirely on us. He looked at Gandalf. Does it? Nothing depends entirely on anyone, Gandalf said. That is perhaps the most important lesson I have spent 3,000 years trying to teach and finding, on most days, that it does not take. He set down his pipe. But no, the War of the Ring moves toward its conclusion through many hands and many choices, of which ours are some but not all. We have bought time here, in this world. What remains to be bought in ours can be bought by others. Can it? Frodo said quietly. The table was silent for a moment, because Frodo's question contained within it the specific, unresolvable uncertainty of someone who knew exactly what had to be done and exactly what doing it would cost and had not yet made peace with the arithmetic. Gandalf looked at him with the full weight of his Maya compassion, not the managed, strategic kindness of a wizard who had learned that emotional support was a useful political tool, but the genuine, ancient, specific care of a being who had watched Frodo carry the ring from the Shire to the edge of the world and had never stopped being aware of what it was costing him. It can, Gandalf said, and it will. That I believe with everything I am. Frodo held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the quiet determination that had always been his most reliable quality, not the dramatic courage of a warrior, but the smaller and more durable courage of Someone who kept moving when moving was the only thing left. Daenerys came to them in the afternoon. She came, as Jon had come, without her counsel, but her solitude had a different quality. More deliberate, less instinctive. She sat across from Gandalf with the precise, careful bearing of a woman who had decided to say something difficult and had prepared for it. With the thoroughness she applied to everything. "I misjudged you," she said to Gandalf. Not an apology. Exactly, she was not a woman whose instinct ran toward apology, but an acknowledgement, offered with the specific gravity of someone for whom acknowledgement was a meaningful concession. "I saw power I did not control and I treated it as a threat. That is," she paused, "that is something I have been told before. I have not always listened." "Power that cannot be categorized is difficult to trust," Gandalf said. "You have survived long enough to know that trust given unwisely is the beginning of the end for queens." He looked at her with the mild, evaluating attention he had given her since they arrived. "Your instinct was not wrong. It was simply operating on incomplete information. That is a correctable condition." Something in Daenerys shifted slightly, a relaxation that was barely visible but genuine. "Will you stay?" she asked. "The realm is not at peace simply because the Night King is gone. Cersei Lannister holds King's Landing. The Iron Throne is not our throne," Gandalf said gently. "And the game played around it is not our game to play. We have our own world, our own war, our own ring to carry to its ending." He looked at her steadily. "You have what you came to this continent to find, Your Grace. You have the North. You have the loyalty of people who fought beside you through the longest night in living memory. You have 2 living dragons and their knowledge of what you are, willing to sacrifice for the people in your care." He paused. "That is a foundation. What you build on it is the question that will define your reign." Daenerys looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Jon Snow, who had come to stand in the doorway of the great hall in the late afternoon light, and the look between them contained everything that the preceding weeks had complicated and the long night had clarified, and the future had not yet resolved. "Then let me give you what I can before you go," she said finally, returning her gaze to Gandalf. "Supplies, horses, safe passage through any territory under my protection." She glanced at Boromir, and the gratitude of a queen who intends to remember this. "We will accept the supplies," Boromir said, with the practical grace of a Gondorian soldier who understood that gratitude was best expressed in things that kept you alive on the road. They left Winterfell on the 3rd morning after the long night, as the pale winter sun climbed the eastern sky and the ravens carried the news of the night. Kings fall southward to every corner of the 7 kingdoms. The people of Winterfell lined the courtyard to watch them go, soldiers and small folk and their lords of the north who had survived the battle, standing in the cold inn silence as the fellowship gathered itself. For the last time in this world, Jon Snow stood at the gate. He shook Aragorn's hand in the manner of soldiers who have fought beside each other and do not need to say what that means. He looked at Gandalf with the expression of a man who had several thousand more questions and had accepted that he was not going to get answers to any of them. "The North remembers," he said. "Then it will remember this," Gandalf said. "That is enough." Gimli embraced Lyanna Mormont, who was 12 years old and 4.5 feet tall, and accepted the embrace of a dwarf she outweighed by approximately nothing, with the complete, unruffled dignity of someone who had faced the army of the dead and found it manageable. She said something to him in a low voice that made the dwarf laugh, the genuine, unguarded laugh of someone who has found an unexpected kindred spirit in an unlikely place. The hobbit said goodbye in the hobbit way, thoroughly, repeatedly, with the specific warmth of creatures who understood that goodbye was a serious business that deserved its full ceremonial weight. Sam shook the hands of every soldier he had tended through the night, remembering each name. Merry and Pippin said farewell to Tormund, who clasped them both by the shoulders with his enormous hands and told them, with perfect sincerity, that they were the best fighters he had ever met under 4 feet tall, which they received as the highest compliment available. Frodo said goodbye to no one in particular and everyone in general, standing in the courtyard with the ring quiet against his chest and the pale winter sun on his face. And he looked at Winterfell, its walls, its banners, its people, with the specific, melancholy attention of a hobbit who was very good at noticing when something was worth remembering. The passage back was where Gandalf had tracked it, a shimmer in the air at the edge of the Wolfswood, barely visible in the winter light, the scar where the glass candle ritual had torn, the fabric between worlds and where it had been slowly, incrementally healing since the Night King fell. They went through it in the order they had arrived. Gandalf first, staff planted, then Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, then Boromir, then the hobbits last. Frodo and Sam side by side as they had been since the beginning, walking together through a door in the world and back to their own. The rift closed behind them without sound. In the Wolfswood, the snow fell in the ordinary way of snow that has no agenda. The trees stood in their long winter silence. The tracks the Fellowship had left on. Their arrival, 9 sets of footprints in the snow, from a morning 3 days past, were already half-filled by fresh snowfall, already being absorbed back into the landscape, already becoming the kind of evidence that could be read as coincidence by those who needed it to be, and as history by those who knew better. In the Great Hall of Winterfell, a Maestus apprentice began a new scroll. He was young, 14, perhaps 15, and he wrote with the careful, slightly unsteady hand of someone still building the muscle memory of scholarship. He wrote because he had been told to write, because that was what Maestus apprentices did in the aftermath of great events, because the Citadel had impressed upon him from his first day of training that the recording of history was a sacred obligation that superseded personal comfort, political convenience, and the natural human desire to simply rest after something extraordinary. He wrote what he had seen and what he had been told by those who had seen more. He wrote about the long night and the Night King's fall. He wrote about the dragons and they, dead, and the gate that Boromir of Gondor had held through 4 hours of assault with a wound in his arm and a Gondorian soldier's absolute refusal to regard the gate as anything other than holding. He wrote about the crypts and the 2 small warriors who had held its entrance against the risen dead with dragonglass blades and the specific, durable courage of creatures whose world had not prepared them for wights, and who had, therefore, simply decided not to find them insurmountable. He wrote about the wizard. He spent a long time on the wizard, because the wizard was the part that resisted the conventions of Maestus, record-keeping most strenuously, a being of power and age and the specific, ancient kindness of something that had lived long enough to know what mattered. And the apprentice was smart enough to know that the conventions of his training were insufficient for the task and honest enough to admit it in the margin of his scroll, in small letters, almost an apology. I do not have the words for what he was. I have only what he did, which was sufficient, and what he said, which was wise, and the way the people of Winterfell looked at him when he left, which was the way you look at something you expect you will not see again and are trying to fix in memory before it goes. He wrote about the ring. He wrote carefully here, following the principle that the most important facts were sometimes best recorded in the most neutral language available, so that future readers could find them without the distortion of the recorder's interpretation. A hobbit named Frodo Baggins carried a ring of gold that was not from this world. Its nature is unknown to me. Its role in the Godswood on the night of the Long Night's End is a matter of dispute among those present. What is not disputed is that he carried it throughout the battle without using it, which several veterans of the Night's Watch, when I asked them about it, told me was the bravest thing they had seen. And they had seen a great deal. He finished his scroll as the sun reached its midpoint and the light through the Maestus window fell across the page in a pale winter bar. He set down his quill. He read what he had written. He added one final line, in the slightly larger letters of a conclusion, because his master had taught him that conclusions were how records spoke to the future, and the future deserved to know what the present had understood. They came from beyond the known world, 9 of them, and they held the line when the line needed holding. The North remembers. So, now, does the record. He rolled the scroll and sealed it and placed it in the archive where it would wait, in the dark and the cold and the patient silence of accumulated history. For whoever came next. They left no banners. They claimed no lands. They bent the knee to nothing and no one. And when the darkness came they stood in it and made it less. 9 souls from a world of. Middle-earth walked into the long night of Westeros and walked back out again. And in the space between, their arrival and their departure, the dead fell and the living held, and the Game of Thrones resumed its eternal, grinding business, smaller now, somehow, against the memory of what those 9 had faced without flinching. The Maestus apprentice was right. The North remembers. And memory, in the end, is how the living defeat the darkness, not by erasing it, but by insisting, in the face of everything, on the record of those who stood.